My name is Karen Nelson, and I'm Dean of the School of Architecture. The BAC has been recognized with distinction for our leadership role in educating an extraordinarily diverse student body to help bring about social equity through the design of landscapes, of historic preservation, of interior architecture, designs for human health, and more. To continue this work, we're announcing a new partnership with Mobile Makers and Boston Planning and Development Authority, which will launch a mobile classroom in Boston this April 19th to bring workshops to Black and Brown students ages 15. Welcome to the fifth event in our Spring 2022 lecture series, Just Design. Professor Kwesi Daniels is Department Head and Assistant Professor of Architecture at Tuskegee University. He's also a mentor of mine who's helping me transform the BAC School of Architecture and its curriculum so that it's more inclusive, more diverse, more just, and more equitable. Professor Daniels' professional experience ranges across many disciplines, including historic preservation, architecture, sustainability management, and urban geography. He's worked for architecture firms and government agencies on public and private sector building projects around the country. Dr. Daniels has played an active role in the National Organization of Minority Architects, NOMA, the Alabama Black Heritage Council, and Kappa Alpha Psi fraternity. His greatest honor has been teaching his students at Tuskegee, Temple, NYU, and Columbia University, in addition to his national lectures.
Let's see.
In 2018, he developed a historic preservation program at Tuskegee University, and this program has now documented civil rights sites in Selma, Montgomery, and Tuskegee, Alabama. Professor Daniels holds a Bachelor of Architecture degree from Tuskegee and a Master of Architecture from the University of Illinois at Chicago, and an MS in Sustainable Management from Columbia University. In 2020, he earned a PhD in Urban Geography from Temple University. His doctoral research focused on studentification and its social impact on West Philadelphia neighborhoods. Tonight's lecture asks architects and designers to exercise their capacity to be societal change agents, with particular emphasis on the significant role that educators play in the process. Many architects are not in tune with the needs of the communities that need the most support. Dr. Daniels is a professional who lives among the 99% and searches for humanity in all the places where society says it does not exist. This lecture will explore his educational and personal journey of discovery from being a student to a professor and now head of the Department of Architecture at Tuskegee. Please give a warm welcome to Professor Kwesi Daniels as he gives his lecture, An Unexpected Journey, Citizen Professor.
Thank you. And as we talked earlier, it's morning somewhere, so we'll just say good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. And yeah. So we'll jump right in. There's an old phrase that we stand on the shoulders of giants, and these three or four images. The first one is a message to ancestors. This is a moment when I visited the Oakland plantation in Natchitoches, Louisiana, and it was for those who are familiar with the institution of enslavement. As a descendant of formerly enslaved, visiting a plantation has never been a part of my bucket list of items, but it was a real surreal moment to stand on the porch of a former plantation and to write a note, something so simple, but so powerful, because 200 years ago, that simple act of writing, holding a piece of paper and pen in my hand and being able to communicate through text could have cost me my life. The next are my grandparents, who, as I reflect on the work that I've done over the course of my career, it's really a reflection of their civil rights activism. Both of them were very, very involved in the NAACP in my local community and were change agents for our community. And my grandfather actually earned an honorary doctorate in community service. So I guess this really comes very natural to me. And then the last is an image of me and my son, who he's is well, actually, he's one of five children, but he is my only son, and there's this special connection that you have with your children that says that if I can't, my job is to make sure that I make it possible for you to stand tall and stand taller. And so if we train them properly, that's very possible. So the question is, how did I arrive here? And that here is historian, geographer, humanist, professor, practitioner. And the journey we'll go through over the next 40 minutes will be what I hope we'll be able to answer that question, because I think I ask that question often. How did I arrive here? So I'll say, while it did not begin with my architecture thesis, my thesis when I was at Tuskegee really outlined what I aspired to do, which was figure out how to address the pandemic challenges that faced my hometown of Asbury Park, New Jersey. This was a community where my parents had a business, a law business still have it for now 30 years. And I watched the impact of divestment and white flight and redlining, all of the things that we know now, but at the time I didn't know this is what it was. But it shaped the way that I matriculated through Tuskegee and shaped the kind of architect that I wanted to be. This gentleman here is one of the people who are responsible for me learning how to carry myself properly. So just the sheer fact of wearing a hat, you see the hats in the background. This is, Mr. Fashion. He was our local mayor before he became the official mayor of the town. And he was a man who was responsible for supporting me through school as I earned A's. He said I would pay you $1 for every A that you would earn. And after a while, he stopped paying me. I guess I broke the bank. And this here is an image of my parents' building, and this really underscores the work that I do today and the work of why I got started with this work. This particular building no longer exists. This building was torn down during the pandemic. They had been in this office on the second level in this corner, and over the course of 20 to 30 years had occupied most of these these offices at one point in time. And my father, who actually studied at Suffolk Law School, a professor told him when he said he was going to open a practice focusing on the African American community, the professor told him, then you're going to be poor. And so he took that charge seriously and decided he would prove him wrong. Can't say that we were rich financially, but we were definitely rich culturally, addressing many of the challenges, or he and my mother addressed many of the challenges that African Americans faced in our community. And I picked up that torch and documented this building, because what it says to me is this is what gentrification begins to look like, because this particular community was 99% Black following the riots in the 60s and the mass exodus of white businesses. And as those businesses left, Black businesses emerged, and my parents were one of them. And then around 2000 and up to now, there's been a strong re-engagement by white businesses and financial resources that were not there, such that this particular building has now been demolished in order to make way for a high-end development that will yield significant funding for the city. But what's more importantly for me is that it symbolizes the eradication of Black businesses that were in this community and thrived in the best way they knew how for over 30 years. But without this type of documentation, there's no way of knowing that they even existed. So I'm going to now talk about my journey. So that's the journey that brought me to Tuskegee. And now I'm going to speak about the journey of my educational philosophy and what set the tone for the work that I've done as an educator, and I believe sets me apart from many of my colleagues, and set me apart from many of my colleagues at Tuskegee. And a lot of it was because of this community-focused approach that was really instilled in me by my grandparents through my parents. So the Shiloh School was a school that we were approached to help with this restoration as a department in 2007, and it had a number of impacts. One, it was a schoolhouse for local residents, and was the culmination of an idea towards rural education that Tuskegee University, then Tuskegee Institute, spearheaded, and it resulted in the development of between 4,000 and 5,000 schools and teacher houses, rural schools between Texas all the way up to Virginia between 1914 and 1940. And this particular schoolhouse is one of the oldest remaining schools that were built during that period. And it has another impact, and it was one of the major hosting sites for men who participated in the United States Public Health Service syphilis study in Macon County. And with COVID, many of us have learned more, have become reintroduced to that study. But as a student at Tuskegee and then a professor, it was an opportunity for us to figure out how do we address the needs of this community. And one of the strategies we recognized was that this community, this schoolhouse needed to be restored. And so we began that restoration through the realizing that in order to restore the schoolhouse, we had to address the needs of its windows. For those who are familiar with the Tuskegee Rosenwald School program, the windows are one of the most significant aspects. They were a design feature that Robert R. Taylor specified for these rural schools because many of them, because they were in rural areas and the communities did not have a lot of income, most of them were sharecropping communities, they didn't have the access to electricity. So the need for lighting to flood into these communities was important, into these facilities was extremely important. And so over the course of a year, we engaged in a serious community service effort of restoring the windows. And this is me back when I had hair and before children. So I often say I lost my hair to my daughters. And then the one on the right are a series of images of students and community residents and youth in the community helping to bring wood into the building to make the windows. These are images of our students scraping the historic windows in order to restore them for the purposes of protecting and preserving the culture of this particular school. And in the process, what we found was that these schools mean more than just, here's a place for people to be educated. These schools served as a community center. The people who would come along the road had not been in the school in 45 years. Many of them would come back, and it was like a huge reunion as they would share stories of the experiences with folks like Mrs. Humphreys, who was their teacher, who would give them jackets in the winter because the parents didn't have them and the students needed jackets, or they would feed them, and sometimes that may have been their only meal. Or teaching parables like good, better, best, never let it rest until your good is better and your better is best. This very simple parable for how to stay engaged educationally was shared with me as one of the experiences that the now grown students had in the schoolhouse, but now sticks with me as I go out. And this is the result of the work that we engaged in. Now, this all happened during a time when I didn't understand the significance of this kind of work. I just thought it was, I mean, this is just what we should do, is be out in the community and helping and supporting the restoration, the preservation of communities surrounding the campus. And I struggled with figuring out how to bridge the gap between architecture and this type of work, because all of the uh, ways that I had been educated, none of them, never did we come out into the community and do work. We never touched a window or a door and figured out how to restore them, or even just studying it. So this was all new ground for me, and even the idea of talking to community residents to figure out what their needs were. All of that was not something that was embedded in me through the curriculum that I went through, both in undergrad and graduate school. So for me, when I started this work around, and I called it sustainability at the time. Now all of us will recognize this. Oh yeah, this is definitely sustainable work. However, when I engaged in this, sustainability was not a catchphrase. It was not a household term. This was around when I started studying sustainability around 2004. This was a term I had to. I bought every book that existed on the market, and at that time it was probably 6 or 7 books, because I was just trying to figure out what this was. And to me, this was social sustainability, being out in the community and helping to preserve it, to bring humanity back to a space that humanity had been ripped from it due to bioethical practices. And so fast forward to coming back to Tuskegee. The question then is, how has my teaching changed in the last 8 years? So when I started this work, this was in 2004 when I began teaching at Tuskegee. I left Tuskegee in 2008, 2009 to pursue a master's in sustainability management. Because, as I mentioned here, while we were doing this great work, I didn't understand how to articulate that this was important architecture work. And so I realized that architecture did a great job of teaching me how to draw a building and design a space, but it did not help me understand how to engage with the social and engage with the sustainable aspects of it and the environmental aspects. And so I felt that a degree in sustainability management would help me do that. It also, from there, I went on to pursue my PhD because sustainability helped me deal with the environmental aspect, but I realized that there was a gap. And that gap was the social aspects of society. As I mentioned previously, and what you see with this image here, uh, the institution of racism has been at the core of American society and many other cultures around our country, around the world for centuries, and we're still struggling with it today. The sheer fact that this school that you see in the background, which is the Armstrong School, and I'll be speaking about it in a little while, came about because of racism. It came about because people in a larger society didn't believe that African Americans should be educated. However, Tuskegee realized that education would be the only strategy to affect change in our communities. However, that change happened through philanthropy. It did not happen through government funding. It didn't happen through taxes. It was through citizens coming together and communities realizing that there's a need for them to have an education. Philanthropists realizing that they can't take their money with them when they pass, and an institution realizing that its ability to educate its students to be able to do the work, all three of those could come together and to produce a product that could benefit society as a whole. And so my doctoral research helped me be able to articulate how racialized policies have shaped the development of urban spaces, and now being in a rural environment to be able to translate that over into rural communities, to be able to demonstrate through work and through research how these spaces have been impacted and how we can bring about change. So what's my teaching process? This is me with the student. As I mentioned, sustainability is at the core of the work I do. And this is an image of how I see the work that we do, is that it's a shared work. It's me with the students and the students and I going out and finding solutions to what we would believe to be impossible problems, like addressing the needs of waste in our communities. This is a chair that this student designed. His name is Nino Chambers, and the chair was made out of shipping pallets and wine cork. And the facility we're in is actually a wine bar. He approached the owners and asked them if they had boxes. They told him no, but we have a whole lot of corks. So he turned the corks into seating. And so the seating that's here is actually made of cork, and the frame is made of shipping pallets. And this was a presentation we were giving of his work on exhibit at the wine bar. Now let's talk about some of the hurdles. So the hurdles that I have encountered that have shaped the way that I engage this work go back to work we were doing in Selma, Alabama, where we were addressing how racialized space is created. And this is before George Floyd was killed. This is before the country recognized the serious need to have uncomfortable conversations. Auburn University and Tuskegee University, through professors in schools of architecture, came together to figure out how we could create a space that would recognize the need for Black people and white people, all cultures and races, to finally sit down and address the elephant in the room. And that architecture specifically needed to address this pandemic hurdle. The reality that because of racialized classifications, we would say that one space was better than another space. And then as a person of color, as I pointed out with my hometown of Asbury Park, New Jersey, I grew up in a racialized space that, because it became predominantly African American, all the resources that are needed in order for the community to thrive, whether it's educationally or academically through education or economically, all of those resources were extracted from the community. And in essence, we grew up in what would, in the 1940s and 50s, be considered a colored environment. Because although separate but equal was ruled outlaw, was outlawed and ruled unlawful, we know that separate but equal environments still exist, whether it's through segregated suburbs or a segregated urban space versus a non-urban space. And as we continue to go out into we see the changes that are taking place in urban environments with gentrification. If we don't address this as schools of architecture, we will continue the same path, and in 60 to 80 years, we'll be back here again when riots are happening again in the streets. And so we took on the task of figuring out how to address this issue in Selma, Alabama. At the SCLC building that's here, and this was a building that formerly housed the SCLC, and voter rights and voter registration happened at the top floor. And we figured out, we were trying to grapple with this idea of racial injustice that existed in this particular town. Here our students are walking across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, which is where Bloody Sunday occurred, where as men and women were preparing to march from Selma to Montgomery, were accosted by Alabama State Troopers. And so this became a pilgrimage for us in not only walking the bridge, but coming to a space that was instrumental in providing us with the opportunity to vote, and recognizing that in this space, many people had lost their lives to vote. And so Auburn being a predominantly predominantly white institution, Tuskegee being a predominantly Black institution, uh, all of the professors, we all came together and said, let's really tackle this problem. Let's see how we can have students sit down and discuss this. And I thought this would be an easy thing. It was just like, yes, I'll just bring them in the room and we'll have the conversation. Unfortunately, we could hear a pin drop. The silence was extremely loud. And it demonstrated to me that this is something that we've not grappled. If our youth, the students that are being trained today, our future architects are going out into the world, if they can't grapple with this challenge of racism, then it means that the architecture that's produced, which was produced by the students, beautiful, beautiful pieces of architecture, very expressive forms, but the forms were devoid of culture. They eliminated much of the historic character in the space. And we realized we didn't have the right language. We weren't properly prepared to train our students to deal with these issues because we couldn't even have a conversation. And if as faculty, if we're not fully equipped to articulate the challenges and then digest them in a way that students could latch onto them and then produce architectural work, then we're not going to prepare them to be able to engage in architecture in the creation of built space for a larger society. And so this was one of the solutions that our students produced, and we thought it was great. But again, what it lacked was engagement around voting rights, any pure acknowledgement of the culture that existed in the area. While it was great from a sustainability standpoint, and it addressed all of the wonderful needs that we talk about today, it was just lacking that ability to talk about the culture of the space. And if we create sanitized environments, then there will movements that we know have been instrumental to the shaping of the world, like the civil rights movement, will not exist. Or better yet, we would not know about their existence. And so this work, over the last 8 years, my work has shifted as we've developed the historic preservation program. And this project was actually one we did right before we engaged preservation. We decided to move towards preservation because we realized we didn't have the right language. We didn't have the right tools. We didn't understand how to address the cultural needs of a community to then embed those cultural needs into the solutions that are produced. And so the sustainable chair that you just saw was the precursor to this. That was done in our first semester studio, and then this design was produced by Mr. Chambers in the second semester studio. And then, so going and looking at the current, what I would recognize as success, but it's ongoing. I don't think it will ever stop, but it's success nonetheless. And that's realizing that we now have the tools to engage with communities and their needs to produce solutions that can help push the ball forward. And we understand how to engage it architecturally. So starting back with the work we did at the Shiloh School, where we were questioning whether or not that was true architecture, whether it was really socially, while I called it social sustainability at the time, there was no language for sustainability at that time for the work we were doing. Now, fast forward, we figured out ways that we can have conversations around restoration through preservation and through architecture. And so we set out a series of goals for this schoolhouse. One was to restore it, and that's where the preservation and the cultural preservation would come in. Second would be the creation of a museum exhibit, which is the design aspect of it. And then through the exhibit, we would be able to preserve history and raise awareness such that we would be producing designs that would be cognizant of the history of the space and would be respectful of the culture of the environment. So we utilized a SWOT analysis that looked at the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities and threats of the environment, uh, recognizing that there was a historical and a significance and strong community support. That because of the lack of outside support and funding needs, that we would have to develop solutions that would take those things into account. We acknowledged that one of its weaknesses was that it was in a rural location and it had an uncommon story. But there's an opportunity through design to educate people and to preserve the history. And so we began the work by doing what we do best. One, speaking with the community of stakeholders, and then incorporating the restoration work through our construction documents course, where our students came out, they measured the building, and we chose to use a construction documents course so that this would not be an aside to the educational process, but would actually be embedded into the curriculum of the school, so that we could demonstrate that we can actually engage socially. We can engage the needs of our local community without having to lift any extra heavy weight, without having to do any extra teaching. We just have to figure out how to tie community-based projects into the classroom and into our existing curriculum. And then we were able to take that work and look at the students who were the top performing. And this gentleman, Mr. Jonathan Phillips, his documentation work earned him the ability to do an internship that summer. And then that internship brought new learning lessons to us. The image that you see on the right, the animated image, is a model that we developed for the project using photogrammetry. And so we were able to bring new tools to the table as we worked on this building in order to raise awareness. We're able to bring the students out to look at the schoolhouse and see that it has serious problems. And as architects, we have to be able to figure out how to solve these problems. So this became not just an academic exercise. This became a real life exercise that, as I say, it's ongoing. We're still trying to figure out how to solve this problem because of all of the challenges we noted earlier. And one of the beautiful things about this is this image is Mr. Phillips right here. As we were out there, he realized that the drawings that he produced earlier were created in a vacuum because we didn't recognize through a drawing that, or didn't document that there was separation in the building, and there were openings on the west facade, and that there are openings in the roof, and all of these have to be acknowledged in order for us to find solutions. And in order to stabilize it and to develop a stabilization plan for it, we needed to get a better understanding of how the building actually worked. And this was probably one of the greatest moments as a teacher, when that light bulb goes off in a student's eyes and they actually want to go out and do more work. Because Mr. Phillips realized, he's like, man, I created these drawings, but they don't tell me enough information. And that was that aha moment was one of the best moments for us as a class. For me as a teacher with a student, where they realized the power of architecture to bring about social change, but the limitations that we sometimes impose on students through the classroom because we put them in a vacuum and have them try to solve real problems. And in this case, we stepped out of that vacuum and we looked at the building as it actually was in order to try to develop solutions for it. And so he was able to take that work and then produce a set of HABS drawings. So we were able to say, not only can you produce the work, but you can also find ways to get it documented and now in this case, get it stored with the Library of Congress. And then beyond that, we then started to engage in a cultural study of it. So looking at this, and this is that new growth. How do we have a conversation about the community? Have a conversation about who this community is and how it got here. And that was through looking at the literature that and research that was out that spoke about the role of the community garden with the schoolhouse when it was originally built. And so students, through looking at precedents and looking at research, were able to put together solutions where gardening were brought into this space. And so if we go back to the design that Mr. Chambers had brought in, we were talking about sustainability. We're now not just saying sustainability for sustainability's sake. We're saying sustainability because a garden was important to this community then. So because it was important to it before, it's a part of the culture of it, and we need to bring it back and bring it back where we can have conversations about gardening as a cultural artifact uh, to this Armstrong community and this Armstrong school, as opposed to just a feel-good experience. And so the design that and plan that they created was one where we're looking at native vegetation and the development of gardens, community garden around it, and then looking at the Armstrong School as a way to reactivate it for community use, where we again returning to that historical expression and looking at how the school took shape 100 years ago, and asking the question, how does it need to take shape today so that students and visitors can understand the schoolhouse, understand its history, and understand its continued contribution to the community of the Armstrong community. And so through this process, the students were able to produce a series of design solutions that respected that cultural heritage of the schoolhouse. And what I feel is then produces a much more well-rounded student, because that student now understands how to engage with the culture, uh, engage with the community, because this work happened through conversations with stakeholders who we can call them clients, we can call them users, but we have to first call them people. And now the students are realizing that they're designing for people, they're designing for culture, they're designing for sustainability, they're recognizing that there's an inherent economic aspect to this that we have to develop solutions for. And then lastly, they're learning how to be real architects in engaging with these spaces. And so through all of this, we've returned to that initial window restoration work that we engaged in over, I guess, 15 years now. This is an image of one of our students now working on a window that is for a resident in the community who the window that he lent us was built in 1850. And this young man, who's one of our construction science students, he's working as a work study student, was, rather than doing work study that just involves you sitting around a desk and trying to figure out how to answer a phone, he's doing work study that is producing a solution for a community resident. It's teaching him a real skill that, as I mentioned earlier, we're looking at communities, particularly urban communities, communities that have been divested from something as simple as a window. For those who recall or are familiar with the theory, broken windows theory, that says that we have to tackle the most minute issues in order to address the needs of the community. Well, this is our take on the broken windows theory. If it's broken, let's fix it. But let's teach students how to fix it, so that the student not only comes out with a degree in architecture or construction, but they also come out with a skill that they can take, where they look at a building and don't say, I have to destroy it, because they realize there may be a cultural value to that building. It may have cultural significance to the local residents, and we can see that it has value. It's just that the windows need to be preserved. We need to just dust it off a little bit. We realize that the windows don't have to be thrown out. This process of restoring windows can engage youth in the community. It can engage local residents It can do exactly what we did with the Armstrong School over 15 years ago, but now this can be embedded into the curriculum, and students can engage in this fruitful work for the community. Thank you.
Oh, are we still here? Oh, good.
Yes.
All right. My screen went dead. I thought somehow the Zoom had been closed. Okay. I have a question, and then I'm going to let other people raise their hands. And we talked about this a little bit, but you talked about how hard it was to speak with the students from Auburn and the students from Tuskegee in your studio and that other studio critics studio. And I'm wondering if you could do it again, let's say in 2023, what would you do differently to build in more success?
Actually, I probably would not do anything differently because society has done a lot of the work for us now. We have to realize that, I mean, well before George Floyd, we had Trayvon Martin. We had Tamir Rice. We had Sandra Bland. We had so many people before George Floyd, but George Floyd was the first one that we actually were there watching him lose his life.
Yeah.
And sadly, it took 8 minutes for the humanity that exists in all of us to be passed on to him, and for us to realize that we all have this human experience. So because of that, it's a lot easier to have these conversations because none of us are hiding behind our own personal experiences and saying, well, because it didn't happen to me or doesn't happen to me, that it is inconsequential and it's not significant enough for us to pay attention to.
Mm-hmm.
We're now saying, no, these are real issues that still go on and people are dealing with them.
Yeah.
And so I would actually like to see what it would look like now to have those students in the classroom, because we can all say, now post George Floyd period, in post COVID, soon to be moment, that we realize that racial injustice still exists in the society, and we're not afraid to say that it does. And so we can now start to see what it looks like as we start to engage in.
Thanks. All right. Other questions? You could raise your hand and unmute, or you can write them in the chat. You're getting a lot of thank you. This is extraordinarily impactful work. Great presentation. Stakeholders. First people. Ashley, any questions?
I do have a question. So first off, thank you, Dr. Daniels. This was wonderful. We're very lucky to have spent the past hour with you. Thank you for sharing your time with us today.
My honor. Thank you.
So I and many of us in this room are just coming from a course called Community Practice, where we are striving to do some of the things that you are doing every day. And right now we have students, they just are beginning to actually engage with communities for the first time on a real project. They spoke with people last week, and they're bravely beginning to try and take the feedback they got from community members and start designing, which, as you know, is no small task, and continue designing and to actually design with communities, not just for communities. And so my question is, do you have any advice for the students in the room as they are undertaking this monumental task? Anything that you would like to share with them?
Definitely. So first, recognize that you have to recognize the inherent humanity of the community. It matters not what community you're in. You're as architects, as designers, as people engaging and being entrusted to take the ideas of other people. We have to see them as humans and realize that we all have our inherent biases that we're bringing to the table, but we have to throw that out. We have to throw out those biases and say, all right, this is a human being. What does a human being need? And how can I figure that out if they have not fully communicated that to me? Secondly, we have to realize that the design happens because we're answering the needs. So you may have to go back and have multiple conversations. The expert for what's needed is the community, not you. That's the hardest aspect of this, is that I have some tools, and I have to figure out how to use my tools to solve the problem that's being presented to me. And I have to, at the end of the process, I have to be able to ask, did I bring something back to the community that answers all the things they asked me? And it may not be this grand expression of creativity that we've been taught, but if the community loves it and they recognize it, and you're able to give signature to the community that's reflective of them, then you've been successful. Possibly. They'll let you know.
Hey, doctor. Okay, if I ask a question? Can you hear me, guys?
Yes.
So, I was paying attention to your story, and I relate a lot with it, although different background, different places, but I guess we all have a little common ground. But I wonder how on earth did you find yourself into architecture? Like, because I get that question a lot, and I personally tell people, "Hi, my name is Awe. I'm an architect." Everywhere I go, and I even hang out with my license on my chest. I don't have it because I'm at home. And they're like, "Why do you have that?" It's because, well, you probably just met the first Dominican architect in Massachusetts. There are more, but I'm gonna claim it. And it's and they're like, "Oh my gosh," and they laugh, and I say, "Well, that's actually very sad. We're gonna change that. We have to change that." So and so I wonder, what your story is and how. I mean, because I don't know if it happened to you, but I didn't fit within the channels of architecture, and I was told in certain places, not the BAC is the best, but in certain other places I didn't belong, right? And I was told that, right? Clearly, just stated, go back home, whatever home is, and how do you find yourself there? How do you break through it? I mean, you, Dr. Daniel. I mean, look, right? Yeah.
So, great question. Um, I'll say first, I got here because of my mother. She bought a book that had professions, A through Z. A was architect, B was botanist, and I think C was chemist. Uh, I couldn't pronounce architect, and I was like, man, that must be hard. I like that. I want to do that thing.
That's a good one.
Yeah, so it stayed with me. And I'll be honest, I didn't really understand what architecture was. I mean, it took me a long time. And I can't say that I totally know what it is, because every day you're engaging it. But every day I feel I get closer and closer, and definitely much further along than I used to be with it. And I I realize I'm also in a very privileged environment, because I'm at Tuskegee, where I'm surrounded by African Americans every day, who and professors who, granted, when I was coming through, there were only 2 Black professors that I had at Tuskegee. But the work that I do now, where I get to uncover all these Black architects who were responsible for making Tuskegee. They literally they taught students how to make bricks, and then those bricks were used to make buildings. And these buildings are still existing. I mean, I was just looking at the first one designed by Robert R. Taylor, who was the first African American graduate of MIT and the first professionally trained African American architect in the country. I was looking at this building, and we're looking at how to preserve it. And the thing is like 4 or 5 white thick. It's like it's a massive building. I get to see architecture through the lens of Black people, and not architecture that's being done because someone said, here's a whole lot of money. It's architecture being done to say, I have to create community for a body of people who don't have community. I'm getting to see architecture at its most essential purpose, which is to address the needs of a population that's coming out of enslavement and figuring out how to lay this, take the stake down for themselves. And so within this very protected environment, I get to grow. I get to be my most full and authentic self without the challenges of racism, without biases, without others' impressions of what my limitations are supposed to be. I get to be limitless, which is scary sometimes. So now when I leave out of that environment, when I went to graduate school, in Chicago or at Columbia or Temple, every single one of these environments, I have stories of how I actually had to go back to Tuskegee to have my soul nourished, because being in a space that's rife with racism and microaggressions and whatever term you want to use, but it's almost like a cesspool of negativity. You have to have a space that you can go back to, and so Tuskegee's been that space for me. And we literally just like rub our hands on the bricks, you can feel the energy, and put your fingers on some fingerprints. And so that's what keeps me here, is because I know the community that I came from. It was a dilapidated space, and learning that dilapidation wasn't because the people came together and decided this is how they wanted to live. It was because you had outside forces that were constantly impacting them. And so I'm in this space and I do this work because if I don't speak up, then there's a great chance that my community will continue to be in this kind of position, without there being anybody to champion the cause for humanity and in recognition of our inherent humanity.
Thank you very much. That was very good.
Simone.
Thank you for the question.
Hi, Dr. Kwesi Daniels.
What's going on, Ms. Sanchez? How you doing?
How are you? I want to acknowledge Kelly's question in the chat, but I also want to add on to that, which is a question about your health and how you maintain energy, because you speak very well about all of the things that you are processing, but there's a lot of pain that is a part of the work that you're doing. And so how are you focusing on your own health and regenerative space to be able to give as much as you are giving to community?
Great question. So I'll start by saying that there's a lot of soul searching. Again, it goes back to the space that I happen to be in. I mean, if you can imagine, let's talk from a sustainability standpoint. We talk about this idea of embodied energy, right? So if we think about a building that's made of brick that a student created, so that student inherently has put energy into that brick, right? And then the brick is fired. So we understand embodied energy by the amount of fired energy that goes into it, but there's human energy that goes into it. Now you multiply that by how many bricks are inside this building. So we can say anywhere from 500,000 to say 1 million bricks are in the buildings that are on our campus. And we have over 60 buildings that were built this way that still exist. So that's a campus full of a lot of embodied energy of Black students who were battling against the challenges and negativity that we talk about every day. So because of that, I get to literally be regenerated every single day and see the beauty of the challenge. Because for me, I find that in this country, we have two ways we look at things. We look at them as a problem. Oh my God, I can't believe that you're doing this. Look at how you're impacting these people or what you're doing. And this is such a problem. I get excited off of that. Like, I genuinely get excited. Like, I don't know if you can see the amount of energy that I have off of that, but I'm like, you mean to tell me that you have such a problem with what I'm doing? You want to burn it down? Man, I must be dope. Oh man, I gotta find like a whole lot more people, because we having too much fun then. We're having too much fun, and people are taking. I found in my experiences, I'm not doing the right thing until I'm pissing people off. Right? It's not until people get upset at what you're doing that you know that you're doing the right thing. if we think about, we learn about the Great Migration of African Americans traveling up from the South to the North. And the only thing we were ever told is that they're traveling for jobs. And then those who dig deeper, they say, oh, it's because of racial terrorism. Well, then I realized that I had to dig a little bit deeper. You don't terrorize anybody unless they're doing something that's bothering you, right? So that means we must have been doing some really kind of dope things in the South that people decided to maraud through and burn our houses down and burn our communities down and burn our schools down. We must have been doing something that was deemed impossible. And because we were doing the impossible, you had to destroy it so that you could maintain this view of what is possible. To me, that's amazing. And it keeps me fired up every day. And it has to fire all of us up. Because that means if that's what you're able to do in an environment that you're being told is all impossible, when we're now in a space everybody says everything is possible. Well, we clearly are nowhere near where they used to be. Because I'm on a campus where over the course of 34 years, they built over 100 structures with student labor. And we're struggling to restore one building. They put the roads in, they put the buildings in, they made the furniture, they brought electricity to it, they brought plumbing to it. I can't even, and they took all of that and they went out and built other communities around the world. Come on, we got a lot of work to do. And so I choose to look at it and say, if I'm pissing somebody off, then I must have to work a little bit harder because they ain't burnt anything down yet. They still like what we're doing. So.
All right, we have time for one really short last question. Juan Antonio, it's yours. You get the last question. You have to unmute, sir. Juan.
Sorry, I was muted. Dr. Daniel, I have a question for you about community engagement. I'm one of the community practice students from Ashley and Rashmi. And the question that I have is, once we engage with the community and we actually get all the information that we need, and we put a couple of different ideas and proposals from the architectural standpoint, right? What happens if they don't want our help, right? What should we do then? I believe that respecting their thought is what we should do, and engaging that would actually show how we actually respect. But any thought about it?
Yes. So one of the things that I'm finding, and it's important for us to realize, as universities, as students, you have to realize that the community that you're engaging with, chances are, has been engaged 500,000 times, right? So you're just the next iteration of somebody being happy to do something. That's where the onus really is on the professor or the department or the program to say, here's a project we're going to be in it for the long term. The Armstrong School, we've been involved with that project for 3 years now. And so the idea that architecture design is an iterative process. Them saying, no, I don't like that, or I have a problem with that, that's the iteration that says, okay, what's the next step? I have to go back to the drawing board. The problem is the academic calendar is only 3 months or 6 months, or if you're lucky, you can get a year and a half, 2 years. But if but a class is only happening for a semester. So that means that as a school, it's the responsibility of the program to figure out how to be engaged long term, such that you can see it through to the end, so that community stays engaged and does not feel disenfranchised by what are really good intentions, but your timeline and their timeline are not the same timeline at all. And we have to acknowledge that, and that's where the school or the professors who have a longer timeline have to figure out how do we design it such that we can get some product out of the student and we can get product out of the program that meet the needs of the community. It's a tough challenge, but we're all definitely up to it.
All right, I'm going to ask everybody to unmute and give Dr. Kwesi Daniels a loud, raucous round of applause, showing how fired up he made. Thank you so much. really appreciate it.
Thank you. This has been awesome.